Welcome everybody. Tonight we're doing our annual review looking at ongoing planetary movements as they unfold into 2026. And I'm delighted to be joined once again by Graham Boston. Many of you will know Graham as he was for many years a committee member and was around at the start of Aquarius Severn in 1981 as well, I believe, or quite early on anyway.
Years after that.
Okay.
About 3 years after.
Okay. Graham's a regular contributor to our post-talk conversations. Graham's a working astrologer, been at that for a long time, and he's currently an astrologer at Page of Wands, which is a London-based consultancy specializing in self-discovery and personal guidance. There are other practitioners involved with that. So if we're ready to go, Graham, I'll pass over to you to kick off.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. I can locate the right thing to share. There we go. Share. Right. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see the opening screen. Okay. So what I do each year, we kind of follow a similar format. I'm going to just step through the main events of 2026 and just show the planetary events in a chart format, in a simplified chart format, so that we all get a clear understanding of exactly what will be happening next year. And I will also include a very brief review of 2025, of the main events or the main astrological events of 2025. Okay, so before I start, I always begin with the outer planet context. So rather than just rushing straight into what's happening next year, I think it's good to orientate ourselves with the outer planets and where they've been over the last few years and what they've been doing, because we are in the midst of cycles always, and those cycles have a beginning, middle, and an end, and it's good to know where we are within those broader cycles. So, as you all know, Pluto has gone into Aquarius. It went in 2023 and last year, and now in 2025 it's been fully in Aquarius, where it stays for the next 18, 19 years. Neptune moved into Aquarius this year, and it goes in permanently next year, or until for the next 14 or so years. And Uranus moved into Gemini this year, and it's moved back into Taurus, as Neptune has moved back into Pisces at the moment. And both of them will move back into those yang signs early next year. And Uranus will stay there for about 7 years. And there's been some major aspects that we all also know about recently, or in the last 5 or so years. The biggie that we all know about is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 2020. There was a lot going on in that year, astrologically and in every other sense. And we had the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions that year, which I think corresponded to the death of George Floyd, and the subsequent worldwide protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. And in this country, the protests over the murder of Sarah Everard as well. Even in the midst of kind of lockdown and COVID and restrictions, people wanted to have their voice heard that year. And that year ended with Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. They happen every 20 or so years. And this one was in Aquarius and kicked off what I call the mini age of Aquarius. So a 20-year period, which is full of Aquarian themes of humanitarianism, technology, groups, the collective, if you like, the collective mind. But it also kicked off a 200-year period, um, which is called the Age of Air. So it's every Jupiter-Saturn conjunction from now on for the next 200 years will take place in the element of air after 200 years where they were in the element of earth. And I won't discuss that, but I'll leave you to ponder that transition that we're in at the moment. Then we had Saturn Uranus squares in 2021. There was a lot of disruption to supply lines that year as we came out of COVID. The Jupiter Neptune conjunction of 2022, I remember very clearly predicting the outbreak of peace. It was in Pisces. How much more peaceful could you get? But in fact, it was the outbreak of war or an invasion by Russia of Ukraine, almost, well, very close to that conjunction in February or March 2022. We had a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction last year, which was, there was a lot of surprises, certain amount of craziness. Around last year, we had the election of Donald Trump, who's a very Uranian character last year. So who was, obviously going to change things. That was his mission, if you like. And then this summer, we had the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. It wasn't exact, as I'll show you a bit later on, but it was very close, and it will be coming back next year. And we also in September had what I call a bridged trine between Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So Uranus in Gemini was trining Pluto in Aquarius, and in between the two of them, and sextiling both of them, was Neptune. And that's quite an unusual configuration, which I might talk about a little bit later. So a quick review of 2025 before we look at 2026. So there were two main features of last year from my point of view. And the first one was the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So it was within 13 degrees of arc at its closest their closest approach to each other in the first couple of degrees of Aries. But they were within 2 degrees of each other from mid-May to mid-September. So here's a graphic showing that. And where it's red is when they were both in Aries within the 2 degrees. I hope I've got that right. Anyway, they were close for quite a long time, for at least 3 months. And so, what happened during that time? Well, quite a lot of things happened. In early July, if you remember, there was flooding in the hill country region of Texas, which very sadly killed well over 100 people, including children at a Christian girls' camp. And it seems as though there wasn't an adequate risk assessment. As the way I understand it, people were unable to call the children or the organisers at the camp to warn them of what was happening to the nearby river, which was overtopping. And I think that has it has a resonance with Saturn Neptune. Obviously, the tragedy of it, the flooding, but also the kind of inadequacy of the risk assessment at that time, which I feel risk assessment is a very Saturnian thing to do. At the end of July, there was also a massive earthquake. In fact, it was the 6th largest recorded And it took place beneath the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, and it generated a tsunami in the Pacific. And this time, early warning systems proved very effective. And also, the tsunami was not as big as feared. So, as far as I know, nobody was killed by that. So, it could have been a lot worse. Um, Earlier in June, there was the seizure of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, and on board which was the climate campaigner Greta Thunberg. And that ship was detained by the Israeli military, and the people on the ship were taken to Israel and detained for a while. Um, and also throughout the whole period of the conjunction, there was a widespread famine in Gaza that we could all witness, due to the deliberate withholding of food aid. In addition to which, there was the repeated slaughter of civilians attempting to get food from the US and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who had taken over the responsibility of distributing food aid from the United Nations. And many people were killed within the vicinity of those food distribution sites as well. So it was not a great time. And I think all those events, have that characteristic of Saturn Neptune. I tend to think of Saturn and Neptune, as we'll be discussing later on after this section, as connected with the slow undermining of things. I won't say more about it. I'll leave that to my discussion with Kris. But that was last summer. And then we had this unusual, what I call a bridged trine, this triangle between Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune, which actually was all the planets were within 1 degree from the 12th of August to the 7th of October. So quite a long time, really. And during this time, NASA announced on the 10th of September, actually, it was closest, that the pattern was closest on the 6th of September, but NASA announced on the 10th of September that the Perseverance rover on Mars had discovered potential signs of life, or biosignatures, as they call it. And they said, quote, the closest we've actually come to discovering ancient life on Mars. They've had a rock sample, which they were studying. They might have been studying it actually within the rover itself, and discovered organic compounds and mineral patterns resembling microbial activity. Also during this time, the Nepalese government fell after Gen Z or Gen Z protests against corruption in Nepal. So young people out on the streets protesting, and I believe being killed by the police as well as a response. And it resulted in the burning down of the Parliament building, and the government collapsed, and the military took hold, or installed a curfew, and their first woman prime minister, an interim prime minister, was installed a few days later, and I believe she's still in power, in place. There was a peace deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which ended 37-year-old hostilities. And also the World Economic Forum released its annual breakthrough technologies list for 2025. And they highlighted advances including engineered living therapeutics, which is programming microbes to produce medicines inside the body, which is pretty extraordinary and kind of science fiction sounding medicine. Also, osmotic power systems, which is the generation of electricity from membranes separating fresh water and seawater. Now, that sounds an incredibly clean way to produce electricity to me. Also, lab-made nanozymes that can help clean up pollution, and also advances in what's called green nitrogen fixation, which is a sustainable way of fertilizing the soil without energy-intensive ammonia production. And the reason that's significant is that ammonia production accounts for nearly 2% of the world's greenhouse gases. So some quite interesting things were happening, perhaps slightly behind the scenes and unnoticed during that period. Whether or not they're connected to this pattern, I don't know, but I kind of think they might be. Right, so 2026, here is the range of motion of the planets throughout the year. So you can see Pluto in early Aquarius, Neptune in early Aries, Uranus going from Taurus to Gemini, Jupiter in Cancer at the moment, moving into Leo, Saturn in Pisces, moving into Aries, Chiron in Aries. I've included Ceres, which moves quite quickly, moving from Aries through to Cancer during the year. And also the moon's nodes, which, if you remember, generally move in a retrograde direction. So this year, the nodes will go from Pisces Virgo into Aquarius Leo. So that's the kind of spread of the planets throughout the year. So 20th January, we have Saturn Uranus sextile. Saturn and Uranus still being in the yin signs of Pisces and Taurus. Then on the 26th of January, Neptune enters Aries, and there it will stay for the next 14 or so years. So late January. On the 14th of February, Saturn joins it in Aries. And then on the 17th of February, a few days later, we have the first eclipse of the year, which is an annular solar eclipse. And an annular eclipse is when the moon is a little bit further away from us on the Earth than it is during a solar eclipse. So it doesn't quite fully eclipse the sun. There's still a kind of border around it, if you like. And that takes place at 28 degrees Aquarius. And it won't be visible in the United Kingdom, but it will be visible in South America, South Africa, and Antarctica. 20th of February, we have the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which Kris and I will be talking about soon. And that takes place at 0 degrees and 45 minutes of Aries. 2nd of March, Mars enters Pisces and joins a lot of other planets in Pisces, plus Saturn and Neptune in early Aries. So it's quite a notable lineup of planets in a 31-degree section of the zodiac. So it'd be interesting to think about which house or houses those planets will be in, because there will no doubt be a lot of activity in that part of your life at that time. 3rd of March, so that was 2nd of March. The day after, we have a total lunar eclipse at 12 degrees, 51 minutes of Virgo. That symbol should be a little bit further down there where my cursor is, so sorry about that. And that will be visible in Northeast Asia, Northwestern North America, and the Central Pacific Ocean. Then on the 28th of March, we have Saturn Pluto sextile in the yang signs of Aquarius and Aries. And 26th of April, Uranus moves into Gemini, where it will stay for approximately 7 years. So by that time, all three of the outer planets are now in yang signs, where they've been hopping in and out of the past year or two. So in a way, that's the start of a definite yang phase, where the yang meaning an outgoing energy, kind of extroverted energy. Then on the 30th of June, Jupiter enters Leo, another yang sign. And then we have an interesting series of aspects that build up during July. So the first of which is Uranus sextiling Neptune at 5 degrees Gemini and Aries. And this is the third of 5 exact sextiles over a 2-year period between Uranus and Neptune. Then that's the 15th of July. Then on the 18th of July, we have another trine between Uranus and Pluto. I say another because the one 2 months ago wasn't quite exact, whereas the one next July, the 18th, will be exact at 4 degrees 29 Aquarius and Gemini. And this will be the first of 5 exact trines over a 2-year period. Then 2 days later, we have 2 aspects on the same day. We have Jupiter opposing Pluto, Jupiter now in early Leo, opposing Pluto in early Aquarius, and Jupiter will be trining Neptune in early Aries. And then, so that was on the 20th. And then the next day, we have Jupiter sextiling Uranus. So you can see that July is full of sextiles and trines. And then on the 25th of July, we have a sextile between Neptune and Pluto. And this one is the first of 13 exact sextiles between 2026 and 2032. Now, this isn't the first time that Neptune has sextiled Pluto in our lifetimes, which Kris will go on to discuss a bit later. But it's the beginning of a whole new tranche or phase of these sextiles between the two outermost planets in, I was going to say traditional astrology, but that means something very different, but traditional 21st century astrology, which kind of ends at Pluto. Traditional 20th century astrology. So all those aspects over the previous few weeks in July are creating this extraordinary basket pattern, which is very unusual, really. We have 2 of these bridged trines, Pluto, Uranus, and Jupiter, Neptune, and an opposition at the same time. So a huge amount going on. And if you see this as a flow of energy, then there's a lot of energy flowing between these planets at that time. And so if you have any planets in your birth chart around 4 degrees, they're going to be aspected by a lot of planets simultaneously. On the 12th of August, we enter a new eclipse season, second of the year, and we have a total solar eclipse at 20 degrees Leo. This will be partially visible in Britain and also visible in Greenland and Spain. In Britain, we'll be able to see it around the evening time. And it'll be at its maximum exactitude at 13 minutes past 7. And then on the 18th of August, the moon's nodes retrograde into Aquarius, or move into Aquarius and Leo, where they stay until March 2028. On the 28th of August, we have a partial lunar eclipse. I think there's always a lunar eclipse after a solar eclipse. And this will take place at 4 degrees and 51 minutes of Pisces. And that will be visible in Britain if you're up just before the sun rises. And then on the 31st of August, we have a trine between Jupiter and Saturn at the middle of Leo and Aries. And on the 16th of September, we have the second of our Neptune Pluto sextiles. And then the 29th of November, we have actually the second trine between Uranus and Pluto in 2026. So I think that's the last of the aspects. However, there's one more thing I want to show you, which is, and I mentioned this last year, which is that I watched a video by astrologer Dan Waits, who was discussing the work of a very good astrologer called Rosie Finn, who had explored the Pluto being out of bounds. And I didn't really know much about what out of bounds meant. I obviously had heard of it, but I kind of had a look and found it very interesting. So out of bounds means that when a planet is more than 23.5 degrees above the ecliptic or more than 23.5 degrees below the ecliptic. So this line in the middle represents the ecliptic, which is the apparent path of the sun around the Earth. And most of the time, planets are above and below the ecliptic or on it. But usually they don't go above this 23.5 degree point, north or south. And when they do, they're said to be out of bounds or beyond the normal rules, the normal solar rules that apply. So there's something kind of wild and untamed about them. And she pointed out that between 2025 and 2035, Pluto is out of bounds. What I didn't quite realize last year is that it's out of bounds only for certain times of the year, generally between July and August, either July or August and December. And I'm just going to post a link in the chat if I can find it. There it is. And that will take you to astroseek.com, where you can actually see the dates over the next 10 years when Pluto goes out of bounds. So it's sort of in the second half of each year for the next 10 years. Pluto is things, the power of Pluto is unchecked. And she said that when Pluto is out of bounds to the south, or rather to the north, it corresponds to periods when the power is in society is concentrated in very few people's hands, and there are dictatorships. And we can see that in 1938. The middle of that period was around the time of the Second World War, when obviously we had dictators like Hitler wreaking havoc. But she looked at previous periods. I'm not going to discuss these now, but it's an interesting idea. And when Pluto is in the south, these are periods of, in her theory, these are periods of times when the power is held by the people, and when there are revolutions, and when people take power. So that's a background theme, perhaps, for the next 10 years. So with that, I shall hand you over to Kris. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so when we talk about Neptune, it's I always like to revisit the discovery chart for Neptune, which quite astonishingly has um, Saturn conjunct. Um, and so it's like it takes Saturn for Neptune to manifest. Um, Neptune was discovered because they found that the orbit of Uranus was being perturbed, and therefore there should be another planet out there. And they eventually mathematically tracked it down and pointed their telescopes in the right direction. Two different individuals, Leverrier and Crouch Adams. And there they found Neptune as predicted. Curiously, it turned out that their mathematics for the um, orbit were actually incorrect, but they happened to be correct for that bit of the orbit that they were looking at that time. Um, and also, Galileo had actually recorded Neptune on two separate occasions in 1612 and 1613, but didn't realize it was a planet. He wasn't really looking for it, so he thought it was another star. On both those occasions, Neptune was conjunct Jupiter. So it seems that Jupiter conjunct Neptune wasn't going to reveal Neptune. Maybe Jupiter in aspect with Neptune makes it even more Neptunian and mysterious. So it required Saturn to bring it into the real world, as it were, or our real world. But it means if you've got that, saying something like that in your birth chart, it means they're always stuck together. They're always going round together. So it's very easy for Saturn to suppress Neptune. And as Graham says, in that case, Neptune would tend to undermine or dissolve Saturn. Just if we talk about Neptune and Saturn, well, Saturn is structure, form, authority, order, wisdom, stability, boundaries, age, fear, law. Neptune is dreams, lack of boundaries, socialism, drugs, delusions, spirituality, dreams, peace, maybe, confusion. So the two are very, very separate. So it's curious that there they are in the discovery chart. So, oh, so just looking at the a bit of history, if we look back at previous conjunctions, these are the dates and the signs. And I'd just like to talk about three different things. One is Russia, one is the environment, and one is economics. So it's been pointed out that the Neptune Saturn cycle seems to be quite related to the long history of Russia and its various incarnations. And I put some of those in that chart. Um, and of course, so yeah, it may be that yeah, we see another big change in Russia this coming year. Of course, we've got all these things going on with supposed peace negotiations. Um, Saturn and Neptune together could do that, I guess. Saturn could bring form to Neptune, but there can also be a lot of deceit in all that. But it will be curious to see if there is some major change in the history of Russia. I mean, we all kind of know what we sort of want that to be, I guess, but we um and curiously, Vladimir Putin has the Saturn Neptune conjunction in his birth chart, which is another curiosity. But Graham, I think you were feeling that maybe this particular conjunction, the main action was more last year because this time will be so fleeting when they actually conjunct.
Yeah, I think so. Although it didn't actually happen, an exact conjunction last year, they were together for actually quite a long period, longer than I realized at the time. Sort of looking back on it, I can see that more clearly. And I also think that although it's really interesting that this conjunction is taking place in the first degree of Aries, which people have said for quite a few years now, have kind of looked forward to this point as a potential reset. Um, oh, sorry, sorry, I just managed to pull my headphones out. Um, Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I um I think that I look back at the last Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which took place in Capricorn in 1989. And I remember vividly sitting there, glued to the TV with my ephemeris in my hands, every day checking the movements of Saturn and Neptune and Jupiter at that time, and just being in awe of what was happening in the world at that time, in the I think it was the late summer, early autumn of '89, as the uh, Berlin Wall was breached, um, following uh, East Germans leaving East Germany, going to Hungary, and then from Hungary to the West earlier, a few months before, during that summer. And astrologically, there was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. To be honest, I can't remember if that happened more than once, whether they retrograded over each other. I can't remember.
In 1989.
But Jupiter was part of that picture as well. It was opposing the Saturn-Neptune conjunction from Cancer. Um, and then soon after, Jupiter opposed Uranus in Capricorn. So there was a lot going on. Um, Whereas this Saturn Neptune conjunction coming up, um, it it actually uh, it's kind of over fairly quickly because Saturn doesn't move back towards Neptune after it's crossed it, and it moves quite swiftly on. So there's a month where between the 15th of February, I think, and the 16th of March, where they are within 1 degree. But then soon after, Saturn moves on. So it seems to be a kind of shorter time period than they were close to each other last summer. Um, and I tend to think of Saturn and Neptune as what Neptune being like the sea, eroding the kind of cliff face of Saturn. It's extraordinary that something as liquid and um, as the sea can actually destroy rock, but of course it can over periods of time. And with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, it was like kind of it was that sort of situation. It it just suddenly collapsed. It's like suddenly people realized it was like a paper tiger. The power, they'd ceased to imbue it with the power um, that it had over many years previously. But I also think of kind of termites undermining foundations of a building. You don't know it's happening until suddenly it collapses. And I think that word collapse is something that I would associate with Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Um, and what I hope collapses next February is, and it's in Aries, sign connected with battles. What I hope collapses is the war in Ukraine.
As you're talking, because we tend to think things will just go on forever in that we view
Yeah,
it from that very Saturn perspective,
yeah,
and don't necessarily see that undermining that's going on.
yeah,
And things can change very, very rapidly.
yeah,
Um, and of course, one of the things in Russia is the state of the economy, which is sort of hanging in there. I mean, I think Saturn and Neptune together, Saturn will hang in there and hang in there and hang in there. But eventually Neptune will break through. It's like a sort of a sea wall. Once there's a
Yes.
little breach,
Yeah.
and the whole wall can go very quickly.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. And just to say on that what you just the word you used, breach, that those were words I remember at the time, those were used that very Neptunian words were being used at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was breached. People flooded through, flooded from East Germany to West Germany, and it was very joyous. So there was a lot of Neptunian metaphors being used at the time.
yeah. So and in economic terms, with because I have a background in economics, and really in the 1980s, new economic orthodoxy came in that I think from my perspective was more about ideology than sensible economics. Um, and I think one of the problems we have in many advanced economies now relate to the fact that economic orthodoxy has reached some of its inevitable conclusion, and the time is ripe for either a return to say what we had in the sort of economic cycle before the 1980s, or maybe new ways of looking at things, and maybe we have to look much more at sustainability and equality, and again, we had a change of government in the UK fairly recently, but from my perspective as an economist, they're essentially just only tweaking the economic policies really, and it does need a whole new outlook in my view. Um, and in terms of the environment, I was yes reminded of the Great Smog of London, 1952. That which is feels like a very Saturn Neptune thing.
Mhm.
This was so smog. It's where you get pollutants in the atmosphere, so that if it becomes foggy, the fog condenses around those, so you get a very thick fog, but also you're trapping all those pollutants. And smog became it was a thing from after the Industrial Revolution. But in 1952, there was this smog in London that was so dense. I mean, people in some as part of that bit literally couldn't, if they went outside, they couldn't see their feet. It was that thick. And of course, it's poisonous. They think about 4,000 immediate deaths from that. Um, Livestock at markets were dying, they were just choking. Um, and this was largely because of people using coal as their main source of heating. So it was one of those occasions where this had been going on for a very long time, uh, over the last 100 or so years, but it was then so bad that something had to be done about it, and it led then to the Clean Air Act, um, which did then start to change, it started saying, "Oh, coal's got to be smokeless in cities." So it was that was an environmental sort of catastrophe that did produce action. And it did lead me on to thinking about the privatization of water companies, which happened on the 1989 Saturn Neptune country in England. So we're talking about something that's very um, England and Wales centered here. Um, Now, again, as someone with a background in economics, they decided to sell off the water companies as part of the economic orthodoxy. But it seemed pretty obvious to me that putting water companies into private ownership would result in businesses that want to sell as much water as possible for as high a price as possible and spend as little as possible on fixing leaks and treating sewage. Um, no other countries in the world have actually fully privatized water, as far as I'm aware. It's just in England and Wales. And so, well, what has happened? We have a major problem in the UK with sewage pollution in rivers. Um, it was a fantastic wheeze for people in on the game to make lots of money, but um, yeah, this is what has happened. And so again, I'm just wondering because the government has been making some changes in trying to deal with this issue. But I wonder again if this can be a jolt towards getting better environmental change. Um, I just want to put I will in a moment put yeah, I will later put a link in the chat box about something I was involved with recently on this score.
Chris.
Yeah.
A couple of days ago, there was a documentary on TV about the Camelford water pollution incident, which happened just before the privatization of water, which the government was very worried would put off investors. So that was an accident where some type of aluminium hydrate or something was put into the wrong tank in the ground. It wasn't meant to be put into the water um, uh, tank, but it got into people's water systems
Mm.
in a 20-mile radius of a Cornish town called Camelford. So, I mean, several people died. A lot of people got poisoned. Their hair turned blue, or weird things like that happened, and animals died. It was pretty horrendous, and a lot of people are probably still um, suffering from the effects of that incident to this day.
Yes, I recall that, and that whole water privatization. That no one, businesses didn't really want to buy it at the time, so the government had to give a lot of money away. It was about 13 billion pounds they gave to companies to actually take on water companies as well. And now the other part of that scandal has been the way a lot of those companies have really, in my view, done abusive things in terms of the finances. They've drained money out. People have made vast amounts of money whilst they're polluting our rivers.
Mm, yeah.
I live right on a riverbank, so I'm maybe extra sensitive.
Mm.
Um, so let's just look at the actual chart for that conjunction. That's set for UK. Um, One could go into that and say well, that's means something about the whole next cycle, but I think primarily what we're looking at is the actual point of that conjunction. And if you've got planet in the first degree of a sign, then that conjunction will be aspecting by transit, and particularly if that's a square or a trine, or indeed a conjunction, both those planets are going to be impacting your chart. And yeah, and as I tend to say, it's always we can be very gloomy about things, but these are opportunities for Saturn and Neptune to work together, as we see from the discovery chart. It's like Neptune needs Saturn. It's just Saturn will probably doesn't really like it, so it tries to sit on top of it. Um, oh, and another point when we were talking earlier, Graham, before this talk, we were saying, oh, both Saturn and Neptune they don't particularly like being in Aries, if you like.
No,
Saturn is,
no.
Saturn is what some people would say is in its fall. It's the opposite sign to Libra, and Neptune is because it's just come out of its rulership sign of Pisces. So it is important to try for us if we're experiencing Neptune and Saturn to, yeah, think about them working together. It's a time to be building dreams, putting dreams into action.
Yes, yeah, and as they're in Aries, it is about action, isn't it? I think Saturn and Neptune together can bring about wisdom and compassion compassion for those who are suffering as well, which is Saturn. Compassion for the less privileged as well. But I think, as you say, in Aries, it's going to have to be translated into action rather than just words.
Yes, it sometimes, yeah, it sometimes feels that compassion's been in quite short supply,
Yeah.
the last year or so.
Yes, indeed.
So
Yeah.
we'll probably come back into the post-talk discussion, and yeah, we'd like to hear your views on Saturn conjunct Neptune. But I'll move on to the next bit. So this is briefly, that was the stellium in March that Graham talked about. The main chart is where is the closest point in those planets. So that's less than 30 degrees,
Mm.
less than a sign's width. Um, and you could say it doesn't actually have any particular meaning other than we think it's a curiosity, but it does mean if you've got planets in that lot, well, particularly if they're, say, 1, 2 degrees, then you get the other planets go over that point very quickly as well. So they can the inner planets can act as sort of activators for wider transits, I think. And then on the 17th of March, the moon joins that. They're not quite so close
Mm.
together, but the moon then goes through that whole sequence. Um, yeah, there's a very temporary grand trine at that closest lineup as well. You can see that there's also a sort of bridge trine, isn't there, as well, on a
Oh,
left
yes.
side. Um, Talking of which, I think that's probably the next slide. Uh, oh no, yeah. Well, we were going to talk about, Graham mentioned Neptune sextile Pluto. I remember when I was first learning astrology in about the 1990, and you'd look at all these charts, and they all seem to have Neptune sextile Pluto in them,
Mhm.
because you tend to be looking at charts from the 1950s onwards, or you were looking at sort of early current charts. Yeah, it was before the 90s, wasn't it? I was in the 80s. I was looking into astrology. So the whole 495-year cycle of Neptune and Pluto started last in 1891, 92. And then there are all these sextiles in the 1950s, and then again in the 1970s and 80s. And then again, we're just going into that now, and 13 times. So in a way, it's like they've never actually got apart. It's like they're there all the time. They probably do go out of aspect a bit,
Yeah.
but it's a background that's always there, and one hopes it's a very benign sort of aspect to have, and that they don't occur in sextile again until 2337. So let's make the most of it. Of course, with the outer planets, trying to work out how they work together is a bit more tricky maybe than when there are inner planets involved, because we see that in charts all the time, and we can say, oh yeah, someone has a moon Neptune conjunction, so we can kind of relate to that. But when it's Neptune and Pluto in aspect, maybe it's a bit more um, numinous to get hold of.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. As you say, it's such a background thing. Most of us have got a Neptune Pluto sextile. It's kind of something we almost took for granted. Um, I I I wonder if it has something to do with learning from experience on a collective level, um, particularly thinking back to the conjunction being in Gemini, which is about learning and knowledge. And I wonder if that sextile is, people born with that sextile hopefully have the ability as generations to to learn from what we're all doing and what's happened in our lives and apply some kind of wisdom and knowledge to make the world slightly better for the next generations. I just think there is that opportunity with this sextile.
Hmm. And yes, and probably many of us will have that aspect tying into the rest of the chart as
Mm.
well. And that's a way to build that energy into one's life, I guess, through the planets. There was also an aspect with.
Yeah.
So then we we kind of move on to the cradle or basket.
Mm.
So so there again we see the um, Neptune Pluto sextile there, but for about a month round about July, there's this cradle aspect going on. And that's just one of the points I just put. That's the point when Jupiter is exactly opposite Pluto, and you can see all those planets are in 4 degrees of something.
Mm.
Um, what do we make of that? Do you make anything of that particularly, Graham? Was just really building on what you just said about Neptune and
Um,
Pluto.
well, obviously a huge flow of energy. If you've got planets at 4 degrees, you're going to know it, I think. To me, it suggests change, loads of possibilities, loads of opportunities for growth, learning. Um, I I tend to think of Jupiter being opposite Pluto, um, about well, as we saw with the conjunction a few years ago, the kind of demand for truth, but also the idea of big projects as well. So I kind of think there's going to be a lot of big ideas, and but they're not just ideas; they're things that can actually happen and take place next summer somehow. I just think there's loads of potential, and I think people will feel that there's an awful lot going on that is potentially very exciting. I mean, it looks very positive to me. It looks like a kind of window of opportunity for positive change, for creativity, for scientific advancement as well, with Uranus trining Pluto, um, but also kind of collective and spiritual advancement. I know those sound very airy-fairy, and I kind of tend to avoid trying to use phrases like that often in my astrology, but it has that kind of sense of there being of things being opened up and full of possibility at that time, I think.
And the Pluto Jupiter, well, it's very ameliorated by those other aspects. You'd expect it to be available
Yeah,
more positively.
yes,
And
yeah,
and because yeah, by then Uranus is finally transition sign. All the planets are now fully in, or those outer planets are fully in these new signs. So again, you could things, as you say, things could feel very different come next summer because it's quite a different picture overall. I may have felt, and maybe going back to Saturn, Neptune, the fact it was there last year, but it didn't quite get there. Maybe once it's gone and it's Saturn has moved past it again, there's we can stop holding our breath, or that was the feeling that just came to mind when I was talking about it, or we can breathe more deeply. Um,
yes,
and yes,
yes.
um,
Yeah, yeah, yes. Certainly that Saturn Neptune could be kind of gloomy. It can have its positive side for sure in terms of, people who are suffering being helped. But I think this energy in the summer is very different. It's very outgoing. They're all in yang signs. It's very busy. Um, I hesitate to mention AI, but I think one has to with Uranus and Gemini trining Pluto. So I think there'll be further advances in that. All sorts of technologies, robotics maybe, though that some people might hate the idea of that. But I think, there'll be big ideas for that Jupiter Pluto, but I think there'll be kind of buy-in, or um, it won't be big ideas imposed on people, big projects imposed on people with those sextiles and trines, as you said, ameliorating that opposition. I think there'll be plenty of opportunities to participate in big changes of some description, probably social changes with Pluto and Aquarius.
And yeah, and the opportunity for those of us with planets around about 4 degrees, because kind of no one's going to really escape a transit, are they? A main transit there, are they? I suppose you could have just quincunx and sextile. Um, but yeah, with those four planets all at 4 degrees, then
Right. Yeah.
yeah, the likelihood is if you've got a natal planet round about there, one of them's going to be hitting it. So
Yeah.
yeah, take advantage.
Yes. Yeah. It could be very exciting.
So we'll just finish this by have a quick look at the solar eclipse in August. And so that's the graphic of the eclipse path. So the path of totality is the darkest stripe there. So we can see in the UK, it's actually it's quite close to totality if you look at those percentages. The further south and west you are, the closer you are to it. That will be enough in the sky to have an effect on nature. It will go noticeably dark, and um, it's kind of my only experience was the 1999 eclipse. No, actually, there's been another one that's been quite not so high percentage as this, but a highest percentage where the atmosphere suddenly seems to change. It goes, wildlife goes quieter, and there's a strange darkness and a stillness somehow. It's you were at the totality of 1999, weren't you, Graham? Although it was
At,
cloudy.
at Plymouth, yes,
Yeah.
it was cloudy, but there was a plane above the clouds, relaying video footage live onto a big screen at Plymouth, on the cliff tops at Plymouth, which was amazing. But I remember it went dark, and bats started coming out, and birds started chirping, and it was like they thought it was the evening. Their behavior changed very
Mm.
quickly, and it did get kind of chilly and strange and interesting and
Yeah.
kind of magical as well.
And wouldn't it be nice for the UK if we had some clear weather as well, but and that on that occasion. But
Yeah, that would be nice.
here's the chart for that. And you can still see that that cradle is still around there
Oh
between
yeah,
really, except it's more, well, Jupiter's going out of aspect, but in that chart you've got Neptune involved with Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus and Venus. So that's sort of quite a nice chart for an eclipse, really, I think, isn't it?
yes, yes, it is. Yeah,
Um, except
yeah.
the eclipse itself is not really particularly connected to the rest of the chart, though, by aspect. Um,
No,
it's almost unaspected. So maybe, yeah, if you've got one of those planets in that chart's conjunct one of your natal planets, then maybe you'll be able to tune into that eclipse in a quite positive way. Um,
yes, yeah.
and
Eclipses can often be quite intense from my perspective, in my experience, often quite dramatic, um, and quite odd in some ways. And I also think that during an eclipse, particularly if that eclipse is on one of your personal planets, um, or an angle, that it's like you get signs from the outside world that are reflecting what's going on inside you. Um, I had a lunar eclipse on my Mars, as I was walking down the street, I think I've told this story before, so apologies if I'm boring anybody, but I was walking down the street, minding my own business, and this young guy walked towards me, and he wasn't getting out of the way, so I moved to the right to get out of his way, and he moved to his left, and deliberately sort of bashed me in the shoulder as he went past. Um, I said, what did you do that for? As he walked away from me, and he just kind of gave me a rude sign without turning round. But I realized he actually embodied the way I was feeling because I was feeling furious about something. And here was this person literally embodying it, which I thought was rather apt for a Mars,
Mm.
an eclipse on my Mars.
Yeah, so look out for things like that, and but also be aware eclipses, as you say, there's a curious quality, and they can be a bit sink plunger like. Um, but it's for me, there's not those changes, they aren't complete. An eclipse might cause something to happen, but there's still unfinished business. That would be part of my
Yes, yeah,
experience. They're sort of unreliable in some way. It's um, so you still have to do some work with whatever the eclipse has been um, aspected in your chart. And of course, if you can see it as well, then yeah, I without going into it, I remember a lunar eclipse that was right on my descendant, and seeing that in the sky, and that seemed that was significant in what was going well in terms of what was going on in a relationship at that time.
mm,
It seemed very apt, and I was in quite an emotional state, and then I could actually look up in the sky and see the eclipsed moon.
yes,
But
yes.
all was well, so I'll stop that share now. Okay, well, I would say thanks to you, Graham. Thanks to me
Pleasure.
as well, I guess. That ends the our
Mm.
presentation. So
Yep. Thank you to Kris too.